The hate group's criminal intention, derived by their estimate from their assumptions in astrology from the stars in the sky, materialized their systematic targeting, which set up a non-official targeting system of using the government for takings of the contracts and the certified contract value, which they then would destroy extra copies of and have their own secret thing hidden away in the various subversions, which would be difficult to discover and therefore must become investigated, asserting the position, such as the character for Hawley's position to engage in that terrorist operation for the war against the American government in the insurrection, asserting the position of the Confederate insurrectionists as is derived by the Klan terrorism, enforcing election fraud or voter fraud, which then bars the elected from entry into the government, nullifying the civilian government in its entirety, engaging in this function, which is a side effect of the estimate of that value, which would have made David the aristocracy from that contract schedule, which would have provided the actual elected, being blocked by the attack against David, and therefore nullifying presidents and congressmen, etc., from being elected legally. And therefore, the voter fraud compels the anti-American government into the position, creating all of the Confederate damages and racist dog whistles against the general public in their war against the government and systemic treason validated by that sedition. Their crimes and abuses in the rewriting of history from their human trafficking and terrorist subversions are evidenced by the embarrassing functions of all of their various targets who would be humiliated in their strengths or others based upon the black market and incited jealousies derived by the Satanist cultists at the very top engaged in the war against the American government for the destruction of society and the human race. This then assumes the position of all of the things that Don Sr. would have wanted or needed without the subversion and being put into by the traumatizing systems from being targeted is assumed to have been targeted anyways in collection with the astrology estimate, which then puts him in a position where he is redirected into the military school, which then asserts his connection to intelligence, which then asserts his position as a spy of being able to have multi-access to multiple groups of people and excuses to have met them, requiring a non-profit for the diversity of all of his functions. As he exponentially excels in the competencies of trading on the market, he would have to start the Legend of David nonprofits structures, which then engage in the establishment of the brokerage, which he would separate from his identity, giving it to David's identity, who would then, as an infant, be emancipated, asserting the position of the free trades despite the active war against the United States by the white trash Klan members, which, engaging in the Neo-Confederacy, engages in the traumatizing terrorist operations, such as their theft by the insurgents, such as from the accountants, which exponentially took a large portion of his money, at which point he would only make deals with the people that he trusted, reaffirming all of the traumatized positions he had already assumed, forcing him exponentially to hyper-concentrate instead of delegating at a wider exchange from businesses, forcing him to make David the Legend of David nonprofit companies so that he can control who he makes deals with so that he doesn't get compromised by insurgents. Only the people he trusts would be the only ones he would be dealing with. To this end, the exponential increases by those estimates assert the hyper-trading competencies, as well as all of the additional benefits, which then creates the position of the discovered estimated values of various services, which then would be sold and therefore generate the value and therefore could be exchanged as a package for other values, creating the foundation of the 7 layers, such as the Snapple facts, with the obligation. And therefore the position of that, put a pin in that, goes to the assertion of the hate group and therefore the position from the princess in those contracting the insurance peace agreement, need David to make agreements with them, but the only way for them to have done that is to force him to do that, and they can't legally force him without engaging in an act of treason, and therefore they would have to assert the position of hyper-accelerating all of the estimated value being targeted and obstructed, which would then certify his status, which would then convince him to join the federal government, becoming the Congressional Oversight Six-Star General, which is a political appointment asserting their ability, giving their unelected congressman the capability of ordering David to take the peace agreement. To this extent, those exponentially compound on themselves as all of David's businesses were projected to be connected to these systems, and therefore the foundation of them are primarily nonprofits, generating profitable returns and exponentially providing charity alongside of them, which then includes all of the various exchanges, such as the zombie insurance and whatnot. To this end, the network of the consolidation and protection and hyperstabilization of the general public, having fixed exponentially amount of its problems, create the position as the Holly King from their estimate, generating the position of the generosity of David having to provide gifts to people in order to have stabilized everything because of the quota on the checklist, to have given a certain amount of charity from the returns from the earnings, requiring David to find ways to exponentially increase the quantity of charity provided in order to justify exponential more profits through other means. This then generates the position of the creation of the game, which David was projected to have invested $3 million a day into from those profits, which is also part of the nonprofit system. And while the system would not be based upon anything free, everything would fundamentally have a cost, but a lot of it in its introductions and quotas and quest lines, etc., would be on a basis of things that David would have paid for or covered the cost for the various players, asserting the position that we're just distant friends, asserting that we can enjoy each other from this, so I'll just cover your entry bill and we can have our fun, which then generates the write-off as the function of a portion of the charity, which then accelerates into the position of the political social media, which then takes over the MySpace and its various exchanges, which then incorporates the games and the absorption of Blockbuster video systematically in the trades as it's starting to collapse into that system, creating a digital version for Blockbuster, systematically renting it online from those systems, as he would systematically take over the buildings and put the computer systems inside of the old Blockbuster buildings, where the videos would be taken and put into backup recordings for the online streaming. But then Jeff Bezos' character asserts the position that David would be doing the same thing as Jeff Bezos and hyper investing into the expansion, making most of the profits generated into cost of business or into the charity itself, exponentially increasing these positions from low resources, as he would actively be trading with Don Sr., who, having the additional protections from being able to trust all of his business partners who are heavily vetted from this situation, which then generates his exponential profits and matures his business competencies, such as his investment into new and startup businesses and recovering collapsed businesses and penny stocks and the rest of them, whichever specialty he would be able to get into, which is primarily generated in a wide variety of subjects, which would translate it as Homer Simpson in The Simpsons, as is created from the assertion that The Simpsons from Springfield is Don Sr. and his family and Springfield, Oregon, which would be the foundation of the starting of those estimates, which then generates the various connections from their assertion. And therefore, the Portland Girl and others who have already inserted into the collapse with the Confederate white supremacist communism in order to enforce this mechanism presumes various functions that they would have viewed as distractive, which they were attacking in order for the defamation, including the position of attempting to get him to buy the shirt off of his own back, asserting such things as women's shelters and the rest, in order to assert the proof positive of the charity types, which then materializes the mechanism of the thing that they're attacking, and therefore, as white supremacist communists were actively training and increasing bullies and domestic abusers for the purposes of destabilizing society so that he could overthrow the government in their war against the United States government. To this extent, that mechanism of blaming the victim for the thing that the accuser is guilty of in the Hegelian dialectic applies that in all of the other magic spells that they have studied through the research in the archaeology from the Nazis and others, discovering all of the tricks throughout societies around the world historically. This then materializes the position of the political social media, which is actively incorporated into the brokerage, as well as David's game, which then materializes the coverage for those various positions, which would then actively apply the government policies postured as things that would actively be vetted through the video game as a political social media, as a platform, materializing people's subroutines and simulations for their ability to assert the side effects of their positions, which would discover the racist dog whistles, such as the various means of extortion and control by indirect measure, which of course leads to the position of the insurance and the protection of the black communities and other Confederate targeted communities, which would have to be rescued from the communism, which would then release them from the white supremacists enforcing the communism, who murdered their leaders and replaced them with house niggers, materializing the automated control of the white supremacist enforcement of communism against their communities, blaming them for having been traumatized by the communism that they view as the only solution to the problems, created as a mechanism to be automated by the parasite causing all of their problems, as they are convinced to be their own worst enemy and systematically collapsed as a society in their hybrid warfare, certified by unitary executive theory or the breach of constitutional law for the express position of the full power of those mechanisms, which then engages in the hyper-decentralizing to an uncomfortable degree of that power of the hyper-concentrated, which basically means wizard anarchy or communism. To this extent, their arbitrary terrorism allows for the roaming hate groups and slave raiders to engage in their terrorist operations for their war against society to overthrow the government. These values, understood, then materialize the hyper-acceleration assumption of the various developments, such as the entry in the expansion of preferred locations for living, such as Hawaii or others, and therefore the various mechanisms of the contract schedule's highest returns potential routes then are automated in that calculation, asserting David's hyperinvestment into Hawaii as a location, which then materializes the assertion of the Lahaina bases, which then increases exponentially in the counter threat operations, where David would have had his bank, which would hold the credit cards company, which also would hold the other digital companies, such as the NFTs distributed in the game, or the cryptocurrencies, which would all be held in the Lahaina Bank, according to their estimates. To an extent, the crime is the confession, and therefore the act of doing the crime for the humiliation in its various traumas and the ability for them to rewrite history by the crafting of the illusions by their hate crimes materializes the confession to the crime as well as the degree of the thing that they're attacking, and therefore more aggression in war deserving a higher investment is the counter to a higher value target, and therefore less aggression asserts the position of an attack against a lesser value target. To these ends, the material traumatizing terrorist operations prove who they believe, rightly or wrongly, to have been important, which then certifies the obstructed contract schedule's importance at a certified value in its diverse forms, which then materializes the position of the fair market value in the takings, which must be returned to those faculties, which, having been restrained in their arrest of the title, materializes the function of their obligation to release the title along with all of the substances defining the title. This includes their war against the Constitution and the violation of all of the rights, such as the breach of the right of association and the right to contract, etc., which then materializes all of the obstructed associations and the potential value in those associations derived by the blocked contracts that they're obligated to pay, which then automatically funds its restoration, which then allows them to re-engage in that company, such as the function of movies or TV shows, which are their own company, which then materialize the capacity to re-engage in the creation of that product list as a company, allowing for the restarting of the free market returns. This, of course, requires somebody else to sue Congress for David Bull's right to pursue by the returning of that title according to the obstructed values used by those subversive mechanisms, physically restraining him and intellectually restraining him from those values, which is actively enforcing the breach of the right of contract, and therefore having to pay the fair market price for the contract certified by their malice according to the estimate. And therefore they have to take that resource and the government has to pay it, and that, being a part of the insurgents' position, becomes a cost to the government, which then, having been gutted by their insurgency, becomes a federal debt to that insurgency, which has to pay the government back for its crimes against the government, leading to the obligation to have paid the takings in order to restore the faculties, which have to be competently and soberly in control of itself in order for the things connected to it to engage in any function with the government, which requires all things on the record to be a sober, educated answer, and therefore the full control of the sober control of the faculties requires the full funding and restoration of those faculties, and the competent, sober control over those faculties is a prerequisite for a sober, educated answer, as all of the information of the education is derived by data held inside of those faculties, which are the only way of explaining the specialties, such as when Congress does an interrogation of an FBI agent in a congressional hearing. They are asking the agent, the faculties of the FBI, to deliver the educated, sober answer, which is derived by the existence of the faculties of the department in a subordinate position, which is colloquially understood to be obvious. And the only way that they would pretend that that wasn't obvious is if they were clearly lying in bad faith, as they're using that mechanism, including the violation of the Constitution, to use process without due process to generate a punishment, which includes the function of the obstruction of David's right to pursue the remedy in violation of the Supreme Court's opinion that everyone clearly from the Constitution, from the plain reading of the Constitution, has a right to pursue it, but the restraints in those subversions obstructing that are a clear violation, certifying their war against the government by attacking fundamental qualities of its faculties, which, being asserted according to their criminal intent, assuming that David would become the six-star general of the congressional oversight, materializes the sedition against the government, crippling vital functions of the government for the damages against the general public by the collapse of the government in the Communist Degrowth structure into the Confederate insurrection, which would bar the civilian government from being able to punish it or retaliate in any way, asserting the cementing of the coup's finality against their hated enemy in material malice. Now, if you understand the concept of multi-universal position, like the multiverse of madness or any of the Marvel exchanges in that, materializes the understanding of variations of what would happen as a consequence of this decision or that decision, materializes the change in the business models, assuming their connection with David, which would have materialized the changes by the value of the obstructed contracts, materializing a completely different series of famous people or wealthy people or important people or the relevant uh, material subroutines in any of the exchanges, such as any of the services or products, such as the video games, which would then change various moves and characters in the negotiation with new people, therefore producing any of the variations that otherwise would be considered inconsistent to people's perceptions, and therefore the unreality enforced by the communism is the attack in their war against reality, in their war against God for Satan, materially changing the observable in the contempt and destruction of reality, which is the obstructed legal contracts and legal associations, which includes the legal profits and outcomes materializing status, wealth, human decency, and other side effects, which would be targeted by the communist hate groups for the hate crime of social violence, economic violence, political violence, and you understand hate crimes of these natures and all of the other definition of hate crimes are fundamental to their social agreement and identity. As the communist hate group targets the wealthy in hatred of the wealthy, they convince people through various spells, such as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, in order to leverage war against the American government, systematically getting it to collapse. Therefore, the Confederates who converted Jews to the Confederate ideals got some of them to accept the Protocols of Learned Elders of Zion as a desirable thing, and then hyper accelerated them in the funding for that position, which would then create a mass conspiracy of hatred against Jews, including the war on terror, where all Jews are considered terrorists, facilitating the position of the final solution of Hitler to be inadequate, as he only wanted to get them out of the jurisdictions they wanted to be in, Lincolnstreim, or whatever land was, materializes the position of hunting them throughout the world, purging the race internationally, which is the primary desired sacrifice system in their plot in that conspiracy. Now, when you ask yourself which Jews would accept that, it's just a normal mafia. You're creating. There were Jews and others that, in order to not be traumatized, accepted alliances with the KKK in order to do hate crimes against other groups in the promotion of the desired central planning of the right type of white central planned communist outcome, which would then engage in the racial purges as one primary mission would accomplish. They would then turn on them and then devour them, as is normal to the communist spell derived by their study from their fake education. So, to this end, historically, it is true. Historically, there is an Italian mafia, there is an Irish mafia, there is an Israeli mafia, there is all kinds of mafia subgroups specific to particular races and communities. And to the ends that that is true, the conspiracy against their own community is self relevant to that position as a pseudo government or an inferior government, such as the position as an extension of villages, as their own series of sub-rebellions materializes their own sub-jurisdictions in those rebellions as de facto alternative territory to the official nation. And they, like the cartels, are able to push out governments and functions and make police scared to go into them, materializing the position of a de facto jurisdiction from their pseudo-nation, which would otherwise being capable of defeating in an actual war, has asserted a foothold according to the jurisdiction by its terrorist operations and systemic overthrowing society stabilizers, which is fundamentally the concept of the invisible empire from those invisible consulates, which then, having been accelerated by the Neo-Confederacy, has generated those subroutines, have created those foothold jurisdictions, materializing the ongoing relentless war against the United States and others. They asserted this in their targeting of David's national news and his ability to form his own personal national news for his own actual speech in the reporting of the news, therefore associated with the political social media and others, as it would have its own subroutines in those systems, aside the blockbuster streaming videos, etc., which then materializes the competencies of a wider, diverse function of services normally provided by David and his nonprofit companies. As the thing is said and the thing is true, when truth and speech of truth becomes illegal, your leaders have become criminals. And being criminals, they have asserted these terrorist operations and traumatizations and embarrassments, which then facilitates the replacement to the legal rights and the side effects with the hate crime targeting and its defamations. And the worse they behave, expressed by their VPNs and other mechanisms in order to engage in defamations, the worse they behave in the defamation, the more they're paid and celebrated in the position of fake opposition to the thing, which was always their problem, which then materializes the function of their distribution of all of those crimes by their various investments into the illusions of those defamations, such as the defamation against a person who would have been working, who's blocked from a contract, of not having earned the blah 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 when it was blocked and therefore a part of the takings from the government, materializing the obligation to have funded the replacement to that contract, stabilizing the person's status and human decency, replacing or ability to fund the replacement of the thing, which, of course, if they were engaged in neo KKK terrorism, has no intention of paying, which then materializes the violation of the constitutional right. In their war against the constitutional republic of the United States, their enemy in war to death, who they despise with extraordinary contempt and malice. And since the objective is the enforcement of the violation of the constitutional right for the enforcement of the white supremacist communism, the obstruction is illegitimate, and their ability to engage in the theft from that subversion is already disqualified by law, and therefore they do not have the authority for their custom without reason in their war against the government, certifying their obligation to pay whether or not they want to, which is why somebody else who is not restrained has to sue for the release of the restrained, for the restrained's ability to engage in the pursuit in the first place, because being restrained they cannot engage in the pursuit and therefore have to be released to that pursuit. And otherwise, in the American law, if they had been restrained by someone loyal to the United States and the government, they would have to communicate the information of the equivalent values from the takings anyways to the government, which is officially being blocked because they, as an insurgency, are not officers of the government. They are insurgent terrorists undermining national security, which is why they need all of the subversions, including the humiliations and such as the editing down for defamation, such as the acknowledgments of the use of Old English, which just sounds like someone who was drunk exponentially, which historically would probably be accurate. To that end, the material position of creating those positions of assaults and traumatizations and subversions and undermining the capability of someone's capability of creating an sober, educated, or pseudo competent speech materializes it into its most traumatized version, where they, from time to time, may be able to eke out a small portion of the truth where they would be able to claim the thing, but it would be so polluted and diluted by the radio radio theater mechanism of playing the old child game telephone, changes the story exponentially by those edits. And while the thing was competent and true in the beginning, the traumatizations and the retellings materialize it into its own desired outcome, which then is the thing that would be communicated to the other party, which then dissolves the entire purpose, which then nullifies the concept itself of the person having been facilitated in the speech with the government or with the general public or otherwise. Their violation of fundamental constitutional rights in their war against the constitutional government. To this extent, the assertion of those blocked values have the capability of someone being able to choose from their assertion in that obstructed contract, for example, David's game, which would be connected to his other systems, such as the brokerage, would allow the person to actually pay for the thing for themselves as an alternative version where they would have chosen it for whatever promotional whatever would have been generated, which then allows them to engage in the actual trades on the market through the brokerage and the purchase of various products by that mechanism as a subroutine market inside of the system, which is real world trades with all of the extra flavor. This then engages in the function of their attempt to actually do necessary force in order to win, which would have required them to have engaged in the various functions of those systems, such as the game, in order to have conducted the thing asserted as the strategy world spell, which would have then done a world spell ice application of transferring the Arctic or others in order to overlap Hawaii according to the game's dynamics, creating the freezing systems and therefore the higher systems from David's investment from his automated systems or bots, which would have been done from the tropic system as a hyper investment for the superpower, which would then turn into the ice mechanisms, would then generate their general international attachment from that, which would then culminate into the position of its connection, generating the ice types, which then would actively incorporate itself into the Pokemon, which then has Pokemon Go, which then has ice lures, which would fundamentally be attached to all of David's systems. So, if anyone went around David's faculties connected to that, his employees would actively be automating for the faculties the various games, such as walking or doing other exercises or whatever it wanted them to do, which then materializes the function with the home location for that position, which would generate the ice lures as an extension to that functional historic understanding, as the position of the ordered game would happen after the major ice spell would materialize the position from order to a survival simulation, as the political social media has to show the side effects of the decisions and their decision to have created that traumatizing effect on a general hypothetical virtual simulation materializes their ability to understand the side effects to the decisions, which would actively, having incorporated the understanding of its various policies and their outcomes, provided a sober, educated votary, which then actually elects the competent leadership at a higher rate. As David's intelligence oversight, or even his non-intelligence oversight, still would provide the nonprofit, which would accelerate their understanding of their educated needs for the general competencies for society, such as being competent in voting and therefore electing the right people, and therefore choosing by direction whoever David as the aristocracy would have led them to choose fundamentally changes who's in the government and not those who are subverted by the various tricks in absence of these fundamental faculties essential to national security. Now, the positions from the various extortions includes Washington's position of having to have a Washington Department for political influence, which David would have done and complied with in either direction, as an extension of the political social media, which then materializes that extension of the hypercompetencies in these relationships and entanglements, which then generates David's influence, which then generates David's political party, uh, as an attachment and acceleration of the other systems, which then makes David's influence as the aristocracy over the elected fundamental, as many of them need David in order to get elected, and therefore the government is chosen by, of, and for David Bulls. The aristocracy is their certified values for their hate crimes according to the system, according to their various failures of imagination, and in their failure of imagination, engaged in, like a liquored up hillbilly, engaged in the mass killing and from their hunting raids, as is derived by their inferiority. It is traumatic and sloppy. Alternatively, this having been derived by David as the aristocracy choosing the elections by the influence over the general public, by that connection materializes their siding with him in the elections of the policy and the elected figures vetted by David, which then materializes his support for his political party, which then materializes his primary control, which then purges the competition from their race to the bottom in policy, which then materializes the ascension of David's political party, which, in absence of competent competition, succeeds exponentially, including their observation of material successes derived by those jurisdictions as an extension acceleration in its business deals with David and the government, as David would receive many of the security contracts, which would then exponentially secure the general public for the purposes of the government, according to political social media, for the hyper-acceleration of that competency. And while everyone else is racing to the bottom, he is exponentially rising and gaining powers and strengths, materializing the stability of the general public against these subversions in a competent, secure civilian population, which forms a government, which everyone seems to be happy with, which infuriates their enemies who would rather they be elected so that they could ruin everything instead, out of sheer hatred and contempt and malice.